The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in pristine white paper with silver ribbon that caught the fluorescent lights of my Norfolk office. My aide, Lieutenant Commander Martinez, had placed it carefully on my desk alongside the morning briefings. But this wasn't official correspondence. The handwriting on the address label was too familiar, too careful, spelling out Admiral Sarah Quinn in the kind of practice script they taught us in elementary school penmanship classes 30 years ago. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I finished reviewing the fleet readiness reports before touching it. The 7th Fleet was conducting exercises in the Pacific, and 3 destroyers needed maintenance scheduling adjustments. The carrier group deployment timeline required my signature, normal Tuesday morning tasks that kept the world's most powerful Navy operating smoothly across 7 time zones. But that package sat there like an accusation, its silver ribbon glinting under the overhead lights. When I finally opened it, tissue paper rustled away to reveal a leather-bound photo album. The cover was embossed with gold lettering, Michael and Victoria, Our Perfect Day. My brother's wedding album, the one I hadn't been invited to receive, the one I hadn't been invited to be part of, the one where I apparently didn't exist. I opened the first page. There was Michael in his Navy dress uniform, not the one he'd earned through service, but a rental costume for his wedding day. Victoria beside him in ivory silk, her smile bright and practiced. The wedding party was arranged in perfect formation behind them. My sister Emma, maid of honor. My cousin David, best man. 7 bridesmaids in dusty rows, 4 groomsmen in matching rental uniforms. I turned the page. The ceremony shots. Michael and Victoria at the altar of St. Matthew's Cathedral in Baltimore, the same church where our grandfather had been married, where our parents had exchanged vows, where I'd been baptized as an infant. Family filling the pews, Uncle Robert with his second wife, Aunt Catherine with her 3 children, the Hendersons from next door when we were kids. Another page. The reception at the Marriott Harbor East. The cake cutting. The first dance. Toasts and laughter captured in careful composition. Table after table of guests raising champagne flutes, their faces warm with celebration and expensive wine. I kept turning pages, looking for myself. Surely there would be one photo, one moment where the camera had caught me in the background, where someone had forgotten the unspoken rule. But page after page revealed the same truth. I had been surgically removed from this family celebration. Not just uninvited, but erased entirely from the visual record. The album contained 247 photographs. I counted them methodically, the way I'd been trained to assess damage reports or casualty figures. Each image told the story of a perfect family wedding, complete in every detail except one. The bride's sister-in-law, who happened to command 18,000 sailors and had just returned from a deployment that kept 3 carrier groups operational in hostile waters, simply didn't exist. My office door stood slightly ajar, and through it I could hear the familiar sounds of the outer office. Martinez fielding phone calls from Pentagon liaisons. Yeoman Phillips organizing the afternoon briefing materials. The quiet efficiency of a command structure that moved in my direction, that trusted my judgment with billion-dollar assets and thousands of lives. I closed the album and reached for my secure phone. The call went through immediately. Quinn, residence. My mother's voice, unchanged after all these years. Still carrying that particular Baltimore accent that never quite left, no matter how many years she'd spent trying to soften it for social occasions. "It's Sarah," I said. A pause. Not surprise, exactly, but the kind of careful recalibration that happened when 2 people who shared DNA but not much else were forced to acknowledge each other's existence. "Oh, hello." I received the wedding album. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear the kitchen sounds in the background. The dishwasher is running. CNN played quietly on the television she kept on the counter. A normal Tuesday morning sounds from a life that had continued without me for the past 8 years. "Victoria thought you might like to have it," she said finally, "since you couldn't make it to the ceremony." Couldn't make it. As if I'd had a scheduling conflict. As if I'd been dealing with a mild case of food poisoning. as if there had been any scenario in which I would have been welcomed at that cathedral. I was in the Mediterranean, I said. Joint operations with NATO forces. We were preventing a humanitarian crisis in 3 different countries. I'm sure it was very important. The dismissal in her voice was so casual, so practiced, that I almost admired its efficiency. 43 years of my life, 25 years of military service, and she could still make it sound like I'd been playing dress-up instead of keeping shipping lanes open for global commerce. Michael looked handsome in the uniform, I said. He did. Victoria insisted on military colors. She thought it was romantic. Military colors. A rented costume for a wedding photo, while I commanded more firepower than most small countries possessed. But Michael had always been the one who looked good in pictures, the one who knew how to smile at the right moment and say the right things to the right people. I had been the one who disappeared for months at a time, who called from satellite phones at odd hours, who sent birthday cards from ports with names they couldn't pronounce. The album is very thorough, I said. She knew what I meant. We both knew what I meant. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of careful omissions and deliberate oversights. Sarah, she said finally, you know how complicated these things are. Complicated. That was the word she'd always used. When I'd graduated from the Naval Academy, and she'd skipped the ceremony because it conflicted with Michael's college graduation party. When I'd received my first command, and she'd forgotten to mention it to anyone at the family Christmas gathering. When I'd been promoted to Admiral and the local newspaper had wanted to do a feature story, she'd politely declined on my behalf. I have a meeting, I said, which was true. I always had meetings. That was what happened when you were responsible for fleet operations across 2 ocean theaters. Of course you do. I ended the call and sat looking at the wedding album. Outside my window, Norfolk Naval Base stretched toward the horizon. Destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and support vessels arranged in careful formation. 18,000 sailors whose lives and safety depended on my decisions. A budget that could fund small nations. Resources that could project American power anywhere on Earth within 72 hours. But in my family's carefully curated version of reality, I remained invisible, a complication to be managed, a detail to be edited out of their perfect photographs. Martinez knocked and entered with the afternoon briefing folder. She glanced at the album on my desk but said nothing. Good officers learn to read situations quickly and respond accordingly. Admiral, the Pentagon is requesting your input on the Pacific deployment schedule. They need your recommendations by Thursday. I'll have them by Wednesday, I said, closing the album. And Martinez, clear my schedule for this weekend. Yes, ma'am. Any particular reason? I looked out the window again, watching a guided missile destroyer prepare for departure. Its crew would spend the next 6 months protecting merchant vessels from pirates, ensuring safe passage for cargo ships carrying everything from grain to medical supplies. Important work. Work that mattered. I'm going to a family gathering, I said. It's time I reminded some people that I exist. The memory hit me while I was reviewing submarine deployment schedules that evening. Something about the precise formation of vessels on my tactical display triggered it. The way my family had arranged themselves at Dad's funeral. Neat rows, calculated positions, everyone knowing exactly where they belonged. Everyone except me. I'd flown back from the Strait of Hormuz in 18 hours, still wearing my working khakis under a hastily borrowed dress coat. The flight had been a logistical nightmare. Military transport through 3 time zones and 2 connecting flights. All arranged so I could stand beside my father's casket and represent the service he'd given 40 years of his life to. Captain James Quinn, Navy Cross recipient, decorated veteran of 3 conflicts, had specifically requested that his daughter deliver the eulogy. He'd written it in his final weeks, when the cancer made speaking difficult, but his mind remained sharp as ever. The eulogy he'd written for me to read contained stories of his proudest moments in uniform, lessons about honor and duty, and a single paragraph about watching his daughter become everything he'd dreamed the Navy could produce. But I never got to read those words. I'd walked into Brennan's funeral home that gray October morning to find the family gathered in the viewing room like a military formation. Mother at the head, flanked by Michael and Emma. Aunts and uncles in supporting positions. Cousins filling the rear ranks. the casket draped in navy blue and gold, positioned exactly as protocol demanded. "Sarah," my mother had said, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for public corrections, "we've made some changes to the service." She gestured toward Michael, resplendent in his dress blues, the same uniform he'd worn to his wedding, but this time earned through 4 years as a supply officer at Great Lakes Naval Station. Logistics and paperwork, honorable work but hardly the stuff of legend. "Michael will be handling the eulogy," she'd continued. "He understands the family perspective better." The family perspective. Not the perspective of the daughter who'd followed her father's path to Annapolis, who'd graduated 3rd in her class, who'd earned her surface warfare pin in record time. Not the perspective of the officer who'd commanded destroyers in hostile waters, who'd led anti-piracy operations off Somalia, who'd been personally decorated by 3 different admirals for exceptional service under fire. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The family perspective belonged to Michael, who'd spent his 4 years of service managing supply inventories and had left the Navy the moment his obligation ended. "Dad wrote the eulogy himself," I'd said. "He asked me to deliver it." Emma had stepped forward then, her expression carefully composed in that way she'd perfected during her years as a corporate communications director. "Mom thought it would be better coming from someone who's been around more. You know, someone the family friends actually recognize." Someone the family friends actually recognize. The words had cut deeper than any enemy fire I'd faced in the Persian Gulf. I'd been protecting American interests in some of the most dangerous waters in the world, while they'd been attending charity galas and country club dinners. But to them, I was the one who'd been absent. I'd reached into my jacket and pulled out the folded pages Dad had given me 3 weeks earlier, when I'd had leave to visit him in the hospital. His handwriting, shaky but determined, covering 4 pages of yellow legal paper. His final words, meant for his final audience, written specifically for me to share. "This is what he wanted," I'd said, holding the pages steady despite the trembling in my hands. Mother had looked at the papers like they were contaminated. "Sarah, we've already printed the programs. Michael's prepared remarks. The family has made its decision." The family had made its decision. Not Dad's decision, not the Navy's decision, not the decision of the man whose life we were supposedly honoring. The family's decision, which somehow never included input from the family member who'd actually inherited his commitment to service. The service had proceeded without me at the podium. Michael had delivered generic remarks about Dad's love of sailing and his dedication to his grandchildren. Safe, sanitized observations that could have described any retired officer, any father, any man who'd lived a reasonably decent life. Nothing about the young ensign who'd volunteered for destroyer duty in Korean waters. Nothing about the lieutenant commander who'd earned the Navy Cross for pulling 13 sailors from a burning engine room. Nothing about the captain who'd mentored dozens of young officers and shaped Navy doctrine for submarine warfare. Nothing about the man who'd written, in his own trembling hand, that watching his daughter become an admiral was the proudest moment of his entire career. I'd sat in the 3rd row, behind aunts I saw once a year and cousins who'd grown up in suburban comfort while I'd been learning to navigate by the stars. I'd listened to Michael's carefully prepared remarks and realized that my family had managed to bury my father without acknowledging that his daughter existed in any meaningful way. After the cemetery, after the reception at the officers' club where Dad's old shipmates had sought me out to share their own stories, after the awkward conversations where family friends expressed surprise that Jimmy Quinn's girl had stayed in the Navy so long, I'd driven back to my hotel alone. The next morning I'd flown back to my ship, back to my crew, my mission, my purpose. Back to the world where my decisions mattered and my presence was not only acknowledged but essential. But the damage had been done in ways I didn't fully understand until months later. The Navy Times had run a small obituary for Captain Quinn, standard practice for decorated veterans. The article mentioned his surviving children, Michael Quinn of Chicago and Emma Quinn Morrison of Philadelphia. No mention of Admiral Sarah Quinn, currently commanding Destroyer Squadron 15 in the Arabian Sea. Someone in my family had provided the information for that obituary. Someone had actively chosen to erase me from the public record of my father's death, just as they'd erased me from my brother's wedding photos. I'd called the newspaper to correct the record, but the damage was done. Dad's Navy friends had seen the article, his academy classmates had read it. The official record of his family survivors had been filed without my name, and no correction could undo that initial erasure. The pattern had started long before the funeral, of course. High school graduation, where I'd been accepted to the Naval Academy, but the family celebration had focused on Michael's acceptance to State University. College graduation, where I'd been commissioned as an ensign, but the photo on Mother's mantelpiece showed only Michael and Emma at their respective ceremonies. Promotion ceremonies that conflicted with family gatherings, until eventually they stopped inviting me and I stopped asking. Each erasure had been small, logical, defensible. I was away so often, my schedule was unpredictable. Military ceremonies were complicated for civilian family members to attend. One by one, I'd been edited out of the family narrative until my absence became normal, expected, barely noticed. But sitting in my quarters that night, looking at Michael and Victoria's wedding album, I understood that my family hadn't just grown comfortable with my absence. They'd grown comfortable with my non-existence. In their carefully curated version of the Quinn family story, I was an inconvenient detail to be managed, not a daughter to be celebrated. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. While they'd been building lives around predictable schedules and manageable expectations, I'd been building the skills and reputation that had landed me in command of forces they couldn't even conceptualize. They saw my service as an extended absence from real life. The Navy saw it as preparation for the kind of leadership that determined whether nations remained free or fell under hostile influence. Tomorrow I would begin planning my return to their world. Not as the absent daughter seeking acceptance, but as Admiral Sarah Quinn, bringing the full weight of my earned authority to bear on the family that had spent decades pretending I didn't exist. They were about to learn the difference between absence and invisibility, and they were about to discover that some people refused to stay erased. The invitation arrived the following Thursday, delivered by certified mail to my quarters rather than my office. Emma's handwriting on the envelope, addressing me as Commander Quinn, despite my promotion to Admiral having been announced in Navy publications 18 months earlier. Either she genuinely didn't know my current rank, or the deliberate diminishment was intentional. With my family, both possibilities seemed equally likely. Inside, expensive cardstock announced a, quote, Quinn family celebration at the Chesapeake Bay Yacht Club, hosted by Michael and Victoria to commemorate their first wedding anniversary. The RSVP card pre-filled my response as regrets, requiring only a signature to confirm my absence. They'd made it easy for me to disappear again, thoughtful in their assumption that I would choose the path of least resistance. I signed Admiral Sarah Quinn in careful script and checked the will attend box instead. My Chief of Staff, Captain Rodriguez, found me that afternoon reviewing catering options on my laptop instead of the usual tactical reports. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing until I asked her opinion on gift selections for wedding anniversaries. Ma'am, if I may ask, is this a social occasion or a military function? Family reunion, I said. The kind where battle dress might be more appropriate than dress blues. Rodriguez had served under my command for 3 years. She'd seen me coordinate multinational naval exercises involving 17 ships and 4,000 personnel. She'd watched me brief congressional committees on Pacific Fleet readiness without notes. She'd stood beside me during the kind of high-stakes diplomatic meetings where the wrong word could destabilize shipping routes worth billions of dollars daily. But she'd never seen me uncertain about anything before. Admiral, she said carefully, would you like me to arrange security for this event? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered that my presence might require protection. But Rodriguez was thinking like the professional she was. A 2-star admiral attending a civilian gathering represented potential security risks that went beyond family dynamics. Negative, I said. This is personal business. Understood, but ma'am, if you're concerned about the reception you'll receive, perhaps… She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Perhaps I should consider whether this confrontation was worth the potential cost to my career, my reputation, and my carefully maintained professional image. Perhaps I should let sleeping families lie. Captain, how long have you known me? 3 years, 2 months, ma'am. In that time, have you ever seen me back down from a necessary engagement? No, ma'am. Then trust me to know when engagement is necessary. She nodded and left me to do my planning. But her question had raised legitimate concerns. I commanded forces spread across 2 oceans. My decisions affected global shipping lanes, international trade relationships, and the strategic balance of power in regions where the wrong move could trigger armed conflict. Did I really want to risk all of that for the satisfaction of proving my existence to people who'd made careers out of ignoring me? The answer came to me that weekend while reviewing personnel files for upcoming promotions. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, Surface Warfare Officer, recommended for early promotion based on exceptional performance in anti-piracy operations. Her record showed 3 commendations for leadership under fire, innovative tactical thinking, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in any academy. Her personnel file also contained a note from her previous commanding officer, outstanding officer hampered by family obligations. Parents frequently call command requesting special accommodation for family events, causing disruption to the operational schedule. I'd seen variations of this note in dozens of files over the years. Talented officers whose families couldn't understand that naval service meant missing birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays. Parents who called commanding officers to complain about deployment schedules, as if military operations could be rearranged around social calendars. But Lieutenant Mitchell had something those other officers lacked. She'd found a way to honor both her family and her service. Her file showed consistent attendance at family gatherings when possible, combined with clear boundaries about operational priorities. Her family had learned to work with her schedule instead of fighting against it. More importantly, they'd learned to be proud of her accomplishments rather than resentful of her absence. That night, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my personal aide, arranging transportation to Baltimore for the following weekend. Commercial flights, not military transport. I wanted to arrive as myself, not as a representative of the United States Navy. The second call was to my academy roommate, Captain Jessica Park, now stationed at the Pentagon, and one of the few people who knew both my professional achievements and my family history. "Jess," I said when she answered, "I need a favor." "Name it." "I'm going to a family gathering this weekend. I want you to be there." A pause. Jessica had met my family exactly once, at my graduation from the academy, where they'd managed to make her feel more welcome in 20 minutes than they'd made me feel in 20 years. "Sarah, are you sure that's wise? Last time you tried to engage with them." "Last time I was a lieutenant commander trying to earn their approval. This time I'm an admiral with nothing left to prove. What do you want me to do?" "Be yourself, wear your dress blues, and when someone asks what you do for a living, tell them the truth." Jessica was the Navy's leading expert on submarine warfare tactics, currently assigned to brief senior Pentagon officials on Pacific Fleet capabilities. She'd written the book, literally, on modern anti-submarine warfare that was required reading at war colleges worldwide. She also happened to be the kind of person who could discuss quantum physics and wine pairings with equal expertise, someone who could fit into any social situation while maintaining her professional gravitas. "You want me to provide context," she said. "I want you to be a witness." The rest of the week passed in careful preparation. I had my dress blues cleaned and pressed, not the working uniform I wore for ceremonies, but the formal version reserved for state dinners and diplomatic functions. I selected jewelry carefully: pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, the Navy Cross pendant Dad had given me when I made captain, and the simple gold watch I'd purchased with my first admiral's paycheck. I practiced conversations in my head while reviewing intelligence briefings, casual responses to the questions I knew would come. Where was I stationed now? What exactly did I do in the Navy? How long did I plan to stay in? The questions they wouldn't ask were more interesting. They wouldn't ask about the 3,000 sailors under my direct command, or the billion-dollar ships I was responsible for, or the classified operations that kept hostile nations from disrupting global commerce. They wouldn't ask about the congressional testimony I'd given last month, or the NATO summit where European admirals had sought my input on Arctic patrol strategies. They wouldn't ask because they couldn't conceive of their absent family member operating in that world. Friday afternoon, I cleared my desk and handed command responsibilities to my deputy for the weekend. The Pacific Fleet would continue operating without my direct oversight for 48 hours, guided by the procedures and protocols I'd established over 3 years of command. As I packed my overnight bag, I realized this would be the first time in 8 years that I'd voluntarily entered my family's territory. Every previous encounter had been forced by circumstance. Dad's illness, emergency family meetings, the funeral I'd flown halfway around the world to attend. This time, I was choosing the battlefield. This time, I was arriving prepared. The drive from Norfolk to Baltimore took 3 hours through countryside that hadn't changed much since my childhood. Small towns, farmland, the kind of America that existed in carefully maintained stability, while I'd been learning to navigate waters where stability was a luxury that had to be earned daily. I checked into the Harbor East Hotel, the same chain where Michael and Victoria had held their reception. From my window, I could see the inner harbor, where tourist boats carried families on safe, predictable tours of waters I'd learned to respect and fear in equal measure. Tomorrow, I would rejoin my family for the first time as Admiral Sarah Quinn. Not the absent daughter seeking acceptance, but the commanding officer they'd never bothered to acknowledge. The battle dress was already pressed and waiting. The Chesapeake Bay Yacht Club occupied a prime waterfront position that screamed old money and older traditions. White columns, manicured lawns, and the kind of understated elegance that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Valet parking attendants in navy blazers directed guests toward the main entrance, where a brass plaque reminded everyone that membership required both financial means and social connections. I arrived precisely at 6, neither early enough to seem eager nor late enough to be noticed for my tardiness. Jessica had driven separately and would arrive 30 minutes later, allowing me to establish the initial dynamic before introducing my witness. The club's main reception room overlooked the harbor, where sunset painted the water in shades of gold and amber. About 60 guests mingled among tables draped in crisp white linen, their conversations creating the kind of pleasant buzz that comes from people who've never worried about anything more threatening than stock market fluctuations. I spotted my family immediately. They'd claimed the central area near the bar, positioned to greet arrivals and control the flow of conversation. Michael wore a navy blazer with brass buttons, the civilian version of military bearing that suggested service without the inconvenience of actual deployment. Victoria glowed in emerald silk, accepting congratulations and air kisses with practiced grace. Mother held court near the windows, surrounded by her bridge club friends and the wives of Michael's business associates. She'd aged well, I noticed, the kind of careful maintenance that came from regular salon appointments and minimal stress. Her pearl necklace caught the light as she gestured, telling some story that had her audience laughing appreciatively. Emma worked the room like the communications professional she was, moving between conversations with business cards and bright smiles. She'd inherited Dad's ability to remember names and faces, but where he'd used that skill to build loyalty among his sailors, she used it to build client relationships for her public relations firm. None of them had noticed my arrival yet. I took a moment to observe the gathering, cataloging faces and relationships the way I'd been trained to assess potential threats and allies in unfamiliar territory. Uncle Robert commanded a corner table, regaling his dinner companions with golf stories that involved increasingly impressive handicaps. Aunt Catherine supervised the photographer, ensuring proper documentation of family happiness. The Henderson neighbors from our childhood had aged into comfortable retirement, their conversation focused on grandchildren and cruise itineraries. I approached the registration table, where a young woman in a yacht club uniform checked names against a guest list. Her smile was professionally welcoming until she reached my entry. "I'm sorry," she said, scanning the list again. "I don't see your name here." "Admiral Sarah Quinn," I said clearly. "I believe I'm listed as family." She frowned, running her finger down the page more slowly. "I have a Sarah Quinn, marked as declined, but—" "There must be some confusion," I said. "I'm Michael Quinn's sister." Her confusion was genuine, the kind that comes from trying to reconcile conflicting information. Someone had clearly told her not to expect me, but here I was, wearing dress blues that commanded respect, even from civilians who didn't understand military hierarchy. "Let me check with Mrs. Quinn," she said, gesturing toward my mother. "Which Mrs. Quinn?" I asked. "There are several here tonight." Before she could answer, Victoria appeared at my elbow with the kind of smile that could cut glass. "Sarah, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you." "I responded to the invitation," I said, though someone seems to have misplaced my RSVP. Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes flicked toward the registration table. "There must have been some confusion with the catering count. I'm sure we can find you a seat somewhere." Somewhere. Not at the family table, not among the honored guests, but somewhere in the margins where unexpected complications could be contained. "I'm sure you can," I agreed. After all, I wouldn't want to disrupt the carefully planned seating arrangements. Michael approached, drink in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Sarah, good to see you." His greeting carried all the warmth of a business handshake. Polite, appropriate, and completely devoid of genuine emotion. We could have been former colleagues meeting accidentally at an airport. "Michael, congratulations on your anniversary." "Thanks. So how long are you in town?" The question contained its own answer, long enough to make an appearance, but surely not long enough to cause significant disruption. I was expected to offer polite congratulations, exchange surface pleasantries, and disappear back to whatever distant posting had kept me absent for the past year. "Just for the weekend," I said. "I have to get back to my command." Victoria tilted her head with practiced interest. "Oh, what do you do now? Still with the Navy?" "Still with the Navy." As if my 25-year career were a temporary phase one might have outgrown, like a college major or an unfortunate hairstyle. "I command the Second Fleet," I said. "Naval operations for the Atlantic and Mediterranean." The information registered as noise rather than meaning. Victoria nodded with the same polite attention she might give someone describing their job in accounting or real estate. The scope of what I'd just described, responsibility for naval forces across 2 theaters, command of nuclear-powered vessels, oversight of operations affecting global commerce, simply had no context in her world. "That sounds important," she said, the way people say, "That's nice," to children showing them crayon drawings. Mother had noticed the commotion and approached with her bridge club entourage in tow. Her expression carried that particular combination of resignation and annoyance reserved for social situations that weren't proceeding according to plan. "Sarah," she said, air kissing my cheek with minimal contact, "what a lovely surprise." The lie was so smooth it could have been rehearsed. Nothing about my presence was lovely or surprising to her. I was a disruption to the evening's careful choreography, an unscripted element in a performance designed to showcase family unity and happiness. "You look well," she continued, her eyes cataloging my uniform with the kind of attention usually reserved for potential stains or fashion mistakes. Though I'm not sure dress blues are quite appropriate for a yacht club celebration. The comment was delivered with a smile, but its message was clear. Even my choice of clothing was wrong for this gathering. In her world, military uniforms were costumes for parades and ceremonies, not appropriate attire for social events among civilized people. "I came straight from a Pentagon briefing," I said. "Didn't have time to change." Pentagon briefing. 2 words that should have commanded respect, or at least curiosity. Instead, they seemed to bounce off my family like sound waves hitting a wall. "Well," Mother said, turning to her friends, "this is my daughter Sarah. She's been traveling with the Navy." Traveling with the Navy. As if I were a passenger on a cruise ship, rather than the commanding officer of a fleet that could level coastal cities or protect them from hostile forces. The introductions continued with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had been a bank president, Mrs. Williams, who chaired the hospital auxiliary, Mrs. Chen, who organized charity golf tournaments for various causes. "Sarah works in maritime security," Mother explained to each new face. "She travels quite a bit for her job." Maritime security. The phrase reduced my command of 18,000 sailors and billion-dollar assets to something that sounded like a corporate consulting position. Technical, respectable, but ultimately uninteresting to people whose concerns centered on social calendars and investment portfolios. "How exciting," Mrs. Patterson said with polite disinterest. "Do you enjoy all that travel?" Before I could answer, the photographer approached our group. He'd been working the room systematically, capturing candid moments and posed family groupings for what would undoubtedly become another carefully curated album. "Mrs. Quinn," he said to my mother, "could we get a few shots of the family together?" "Of course," she replied, beginning to arrange Michael, Victoria, and Emma into photogenic positions. I stood waiting to be included in the arrangement, but the photographer's lens was already focused on the group of four. The same four who had appeared in Michael's wedding album, the same four who represented the official Quinn family narrative. "Should we?" I began. "Oh," Mother said, as if suddenly remembering my presence. "Sarah, would you mind taking some photos of us? I think you have a better angle from over there." She wanted me to photograph them, to document their togetherness from the outside, to serve as the invisible recorder of their happiness rather than a participant in it. The moment crystallized everything that had happened over the past 8 years. I wasn't being excluded from the family photos by accident or oversight. I was being actively erased, repositioned from subject to photographer, from participant to observer. "I think I'll pass," I said quietly. The photographer lowered his camera, confused by the sudden tension. Mother's smile grew tighter, the kind that meant consequences would follow later in private conversation. "Sarah," she said, "we're just trying to get some nice pictures." "I'm sure you are," I replied, "the same way you got nice pictures at Michael's wedding." The group fell silent. Not the comfortable pause of people gathering their thoughts, but the sharp stillness that follows when someone says the thing that everyone has been pretending doesn't exist. Victoria's grip tightened on Michael's arm. Emma suddenly found her champagne glass fascinating. The photographer continued standing there, camera ready, waiting for direction from people who had momentarily forgotten how to perform. That's when Jessica walked into the room, and everything changed. Jessica Park entered the yacht club reception room like she owned it, which in a way, she did. 25 years of naval service had taught her how to command attention without demanding it, how to project authority through posture and presence, rather than volume or aggression. Her dress blues were immaculate, her ribbons arranged in perfect formation, her bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. She paused in the doorway, scanning the crowd with the kind of tactical awareness that came from briefing Pentagon officials on matters of national security. When her eyes found mine, she smiled and moved through the gathering like a guided missile with social graces. "Admiral Quinn," she said as she approached, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by my family and their photographer. "I apologize for the delay." The Joint Chiefs meeting ran longer than expected. The words hit the group like depth charges. Joint Chiefs meeting, not a casual reference or an exaggeration, but a simple statement of fact delivered with the casual authority of someone who routinely moved in those circles. Mother's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. Victoria's smile became a rigid mask. Michael straightened unconsciously, the reflexive response of someone who'd spent enough time in uniform to recognize when they were in the presence of serious military authority. "Captain Park," I replied, matching her professional tone. "I was just introducing my family to the concept of accurate photography." Jessica's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch, taking in the scene with the kind of rapid assessment that had made her the Navy's go-to expert on crisis management. The photographer stood ready with his camera. My family arranged in their perfect formation, me standing apart, clearly excluded from whatever image they were trying to create. "How interesting," Jessica said. "In my experience, the most important people are often missing from official photographs." Her observation carried the weight of someone who'd noticed similar dynamics in diplomatic settings, where protocol battles were fought over seating arrangements and photo positioning. She understood immediately what was happening and why it mattered. The photographer, sensing he'd stumbled into something more complex than a simple family portrait, lowered his camera again. Would you like me to include?" "Actually," Jessica interrupted smoothly, "before we continue with photos, might I suggest we properly introduce everyone? I'm Captain Jessica Park, Pentagon Strategic Planning Division. I serve as the Navy's liaison to the Joint Chiefs for Submarine Warfare Doctrine." She paused, letting that information settle like sediment in still water. Pentagon Strategic Planning, Joint Chiefs Liaison, Submarine Warfare Doctrine. Each phrase carried weight that even civilians could recognize as significant. "I've had the privilege of serving under Admiral Quinn's command on several occasions," Jessica continued. "Most recently during the NATO exercises that prevented 3 potential international incidents in the Mediterranean." The silence that followed was different from the earlier awkwardness. This wasn't confusion or social discomfort. This was the moment when carefully maintained illusions encountered immovable reality. "Admiral," Mrs. Patterson said faintly, as if the word were foreign. "Admiral Sarah Quinn," Jessica confirmed. "Commander of the Second Fleet. She's responsible for naval operations from the Arctic Circle to the coast of Africa. Under her command are 57 ships, including 4 aircraft carriers, and approximately 18,000 personnel." Mother set her champagne glass down with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. 18,000? "Personnel," Jessica repeated. "That doesn't include the Marines attached to her carrier groups, or the Coast Guard units that coordinate with her operations. If we're counting total force projection capability, we're looking at closer to 30,000 people who take orders from Admiral Quinn on any given day." Victoria's hand moved to her throat, an unconscious gesture that betrayed her shock. We had no idea." "The Admiral is quite modest about her responsibilities," Jessica said. "Most people don't realize that she's currently overseeing the largest naval exercise in Atlantic history. 17 nations, 43 ships, and a budget that exceeds the GDP of most small countries." Emma finally found her voice. "But she told us she worked in maritime security." "Maritime security," Jessica repeated, her tone suggesting that while the description was technically accurate, it was rather like describing the president as someone who works in government administration. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe it." The photographer had been following this conversation like a tennis match, his professional instincts warring with his confusion about what exactly he was supposed to be documenting. Finally, he raised his camera tentatively. "So should I include the Admiral in the family photos?" Before anyone else could answer, Michael stepped forward. His face had gone pale, but his voice carried the remnants of his military training. "Of course she should be included. She's family." The words came out strained, forced, but they came out. Victoria nodded quickly, too quickly, her social training finally kicking in to manage what had become a public relations disaster. "Absolutely," she said. "We were just... the lighting was..." She didn't finish the sentence because there was no way to finish it that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was. A transparent excuse for deliberate exclusion. But Jessica wasn't finished. "Actually," she said, "before we take any photos, I should mention that Admiral Quinn received some rather exciting news yesterday." She turned to me with the kind of smile that contained classified information. "Congratulations, by the way. The appointment isn't public yet, but I believe your family should know." I felt the familiar weight of protocol and procedure, the careful balance between what could be said and what must remain classified. But Jessica's use of the word appointment created space for careful revelation. "The Secretary of the Navy has recommended Admiral Quinn for promotion to Vice Admiral," Jessica announced. "She'll be taking command of Fleet Forces Command next year, the youngest woman in Navy history to reach that position." The second explosion was quieter, but more devastating than the first. Fleet Forces Command. Even Michael, with his limited military experience, understood what that meant. Not just command of a fleet, but command of all fleets. Strategic oversight of the entire Atlantic naval operations. Mother sank into the nearest chair without apparent awareness that she was moving. Her bridge club friends stared at me as if I'd undergone physical transformation before their eyes. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "Fleet Forces Command," Uncle Robert repeated from across the room, his Gulf stories forgotten. That's the entire East Coast." "East Coast, Atlantic Ocean, Mediterranean Sea, and Arctic operations," Jessica confirmed. "Roughly half of the world's oceans, strategically speaking." Emma pulled out her phone with the reflexive movement of someone whose professional life revolved around managing information flow. Her fingers moved rapidly across the screen, undoubtedly searching for confirmation of what she'd just heard. "The appointment ceremony will be at the Pentagon," Jessica continued. "Vice President will be attending, along with the full Joint Chiefs. It's quite an honor." She paused, looking around the group with polite interest. I assume the family will be there for the ceremony? The question hung in the air, like an unexploded ordnance. Of course they would want to attend such a significant event. Of course they would want to be associated with this level of achievement. Of course they would want to be photographed with the youngest woman in Navy history to reach such a position. Of course they had never been invited to any of my previous promotion ceremonies, because they had never acknowledged that such ceremonies existed. Mother began, then stopped. How do you explain 8 years of systematic erasure to someone who's just described the reality of what you chose to ignore? Well, Jessica said brightly, I'm sure we can work out the details later. Right now I believe we were discussing family photographs. The photographer raised his camera again, but this time no one needed to arrange themselves. The entire dynamic had shifted, and everyone understood their new positions in the hierarchy. I was no longer the absent daughter who might be squeezed into a corner of the frame. I was Admiral Sarah Quinn, and Admiral Sarah Quinn belonged at the center of any photograph that included her family. The flash went off, capturing what would become the first family photo in 8 years where I wasn't invisible. But more importantly, it captured the moment when my family finally understood that they were the ones who had been absent from my life, not the other way around. The dinner that followed was a masterclass in social reconstruction. Within 20 minutes of Jessica's revelation, I'd been moved from wherever they'd originally planned to seat me to the place of honor at the head table, directly beside Michael and Victoria. The same people who'd treated me like an unwelcome gatecrasher now competed for my attention with the desperate intensity of political candidates courting crucial voters. Uncle Robert materialized at my elbow with a fresh drink and suddenly remembered that his grandson was considering a military career. Maybe you could give him some advice about the Naval Academy application process, he asked, his golf handicap stories replaced by earnest questions about service opportunities. Aunt Catherine appeared with her phone, asking if I'd mind taking a photo with her daughter's boyfriend, who was apparently, quote, very interested in naval history. The boyfriend, a nervous-looking accountant named Dave, shook my hand with the kind of reverence usually reserved for meeting celebrities. I had no idea Victoria's family was so distinguished, he whispered, apparently unaware that Victoria was my sister-in-law, not my blood relative. Mrs. Patterson cornered me near the dessert table, her bridge club friends flanking her like a military formation. Admiral, I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you know Admiral Morrison? He's my nephew's commanding officer in San Diego. The name was familiar. Morrison commanded the 3rd Fleet on the Pacific side, but I couldn't resist the irony. Actually, Admiral Morrison reports to my counterpart on the West Coast. We coordinate joint operations fairly regularly. Her eyes widened. You coordinate with other admirals? Fleet coordination is part of the job, I said simply. We can't have the Atlantic and Pacific operations working at cross purposes. She nodded as if this made perfect sense, though I could see her mind struggling to process the concept that the woman she'd dismissed as a, quote, traveling security worker 30 minutes earlier was now describing casual professional relationships with officers she'd previously considered impossibly high-ranking. Jessica observed these interactions with the amused detachment of someone watching a social experiment unfold. She'd positioned herself near the bar, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough away to let the family navigate their new reality without interference. Interesting group, she murmured when I managed to escape the photo requests long enough to check in with her. They're adapting quickly, I replied. Social survival instincts. Your mother hasn't said a word to you since the photographer finished. I glanced across the room to where Mother sat at her table, surrounded by her bridge club friends, but somehow isolated from their conversation. She kept looking in my direction, then away again, like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. She's processing, I said. 25 years of deliberate ignorance doesn't get corrected in 25 minutes. Emma approached us with her phone in hand, her communications training finally kicking in after the initial shock. Sarah, I've been looking into your promotion announcement. When exactly will it be public? The secretary's office handles those timelines, I said, probably next month. And the ceremony? Pentagon, like Captain Park mentioned. Emma nodded, her mind clearly working through the implications. As a PR professional, she understood better than anyone how this revelation would play in their social circles. The Quinn family, which had spent years explaining my absence at gatherings, would suddenly have to explain why they'd never mentioned having an admiral in the family. Would it be possible to get some advance notice, she asked carefully, for planning purposes? Planning purposes? Well, the family should be prepared for media attention. Local news will probably want to cover the story. Woman admiral, Baltimore area family, breaking barriers. It's exactly the kind of human interest piece they love. I studied my sister's face, recognizing the moment when personal damage control merged with professional opportunity. Emma wasn't just thinking about repairing the family's relationship with me. She was thinking about how to manage the narrative around my success. The Navy handles its own media relations, I said, but I'm sure they'd be happy to coordinate with you if the family wants to participate. Of course we want to participate, she said quickly. We're proud of you. We've always been proud of you. Always. The word hung between us like a bridge built over a canyon. We both knew it wasn't true, but we also both understood that truth was less important now than rebuilding functional family relationships. I appreciate that, I said, meaning it more than I'd expected to. Victoria appeared beside Emma, her earlier shock replaced by the kind of focused determination that had probably made her successful in whatever career she'd pursued before becoming Michael's wife. Sarah, I owe you an apology, she said, about earlier with the seating and the photos. I honestly had no idea about your position in the Navy. Most people don't understand military hierarchy, I replied diplomatically. But I should have, she continued. Michael talks about his service all the time, and I should have realized that if you've been in longer, you probably… She trailed off, realizing that the math didn't work in her favor. Michael's 4 years as a supply officer, no matter how honorable, couldn't compete with my 25-year career progression through increasingly senior commands. Military careers take different paths, I said, throwing her a lifeline. Michael chose to serve his time and return to civilian life. I chose to make it a lifetime commitment. Both choices have value. She nodded gratefully, but I could see her recalibrating everything she thought she knew about family hierarchy and social status. In her world, Michael was the successful businessman with the military background that added gravitas to his resume. Now she was discovering that his military experience was training wheels compared to mine. Michael himself had been circulating through the room, playing host with more intensity than the occasion seemed to require. Every few minutes, he'd catch my eye across the room and nod, as if checking to make sure I was still there, still real, still the sister whose existence he'd managed to forget for most of the evening. Finally, he approached during a lull in my conversations with distant relatives and family friends. Sarah, he said, could we talk privately for a minute? I followed him to a quiet corner of the reception room, away from the crowd but still visible to the other guests. He'd chosen the location carefully, private enough for honest conversation, public enough to demonstrate that he was engaging with me as family. I messed up, he said without preamble, tonight and for years before tonight. I let Mom and Emma convince me that you were choosing the military over family, when really we were choosing ignorance over understanding. The apology was more direct than I'd expected, less carefully crafted than the social pleasantries that had dominated the evening. Michael. No, let me finish, he said. When Dad died and you flew back from wherever you were serving, I should have stood up for you about the eulogy. I knew he'd written it specifically for you to read. I knew it meant something to him that his daughter would deliver those words. He paused, looking out at the harbor where lights from passing boats reflected on the dark water. I let Mom talk me into taking over because it was easier than confronting her about what she was doing to you. And tonight, with the photos and the seating, I did the same thing again. I let Victoria and Mom treat you like you were some kind of inconvenience instead of my sister. You couldn't have known about my promotion, I said. I should have known about everything else, he replied. I should have paid attention to your career, asked questions, made an effort to understand what you were accomplishing. Instead, I let everyone pretend you were just traveling with the Navy like some kind of military tourist. The conversation was interrupted by the yacht club's event coordinator approaching with clipboard in hand. Excuse me, Admiral Quinn? I have some gentlemen at the front desk asking to speak with you. They say they're from the Washington Post. Michael's face went pale. The Washington Post? I sighed. News traveled fast in military circles. And Jessica's mention of the Joint Chiefs meeting had probably triggered some enterprising reporter's interest in tracking down the story behind my family connections. "I'll handle it," I said. "But Michael, we should probably continue this conversation later. Things are about to get more complicated." As I walked toward the front desk, I realized that my family's 8-year experiment in pretending I didn't exist was about to become very public knowledge. The Washington Post didn't send reporters to yacht club anniversary parties unless there was a story worth telling. And Admiral Sarah Quinn, the youngest woman ever appointed to Fleet Forces Command, whose own family had erased her from their wedding photos, was definitely a story worth telling. The USS Constitution was berthed at Boston Harbor for Fleet Week, her ancient wooden hull gleaming under the September sun. I stood on her deck in my dress whites, watching thousands of visitors tour the ship that had helped birth American naval tradition. Families clustered around cannon displays while children pressed against rope barriers, their eyes wide with wonder at stories of battles fought when the nation was young and uncertain. This was my final official act as Admiral of the Second Fleet. Tomorrow I would transfer command to Admiral Patricia Morrison and begin my new assignment in Washington as Director of Naval Personnel. 5 years of fleet command had taught me that the Navy's greatest battles weren't always fought at sea. Sometimes they were fought in Pentagon conference rooms, where budget decisions determined whether ships sailed or rested in port. "Ma'am," Captain Stevens approached with a folder marked with the seal of the Secretary of the Navy, "the final transfer documents for your signature." I signed the papers that formally ended my command of 18,000 sailors and began my oversight of 400,000 Navy personnel worldwide. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman my family had erased from their photographs now held authority over military career progression for the entire United States Navy. Emma appeared at the gangway, dressed in navy blue as if she'd coordinated her outfit with the ship's colors. She'd driven up from New York specifically for the ceremony, leaving her public relations firm in the hands of her partners for the first time in 2 years. "Sarah," she said, embracing me with genuine warmth that would have been impossible a year ago, "I wanted to give you this before the ceremony begins." She handed me a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be official correspondence. I opened it to find a letter on White House letterhead, signed by the President's Chief of Staff. "The President's Commission on Military Family Support?" I read aloud. "They want you to chair it," Emma said. "A 2-year appointment to study and recommend policies for improving communication between military personnel and their families. The commission will have subpoena power and direct access to Pentagon personnel records." I studied the letter more carefully. The commission's mandate was broader than I'd initially realized. Not just family communication, but a comprehensive review of how military culture affected personal relationships across all service branches. "Emma, how did you know about this before I did?" She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully managed a complex information campaign. "I may have mentioned your family situation expertise to a few contacts in Washington. Sometimes the best recommendations come from people who've seen you handle difficult situations personally. You lobbied for this appointment?" "I leveraged your existing reputation," she corrected. "The Walsh case, your Fleet Forces Command reforms, your Naval War College presentations, you built credibility. I just made sure the right people understood how your experience applied to broader military family issues." The appointment letter included a briefing schedule that would begin the following month. Site visits to major military installations, interviews with service families, review of existing support programs. The kind of comprehensive assessment that could reshape how the military approached the intersection of professional service and personal relationships. Victoria appeared beside Emma, carrying a small, wrapped package. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to give you something before you leave for Washington." I unwrapped the package to find a silver picture frame containing a photograph I'd never seen before. My father, in his navy dress blues, standing beside a young woman in civilian clothes. The woman was me, age 22, newly commissioned as an ensign. We stood together outside the Naval Academy chapel after my graduation ceremony. "I found this in Dad's personal effects," Victoria said. "He kept it on his desk at work, but somehow it never made it into any family albums. I thought you should have it." The photograph captured a moment I'd forgotten. Dad's pride in my commissioning, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning with the confidence of people who believed the future held unlimited possibilities. Before deployment separated us, before family obligations conflicted with military duty, before anyone learned to erase what they couldn't understand. "Victoria," I began. "I also wanted you to know that Michael and I have been working with military family counselors on the Family Bridges program," she continued. "We've learned some uncomfortable truths about how civilian spouses can inadvertently undermine their partner's military careers through lack of understanding or support." She paused, looking out at Boston Harbor, where modern destroyers anchored near the historic ship we stood on. "I spent 2 years married to a Navy officer without comprehending what that meant," she said. "Not just for Michael, but for the families of the sailors he worked with, the families of the officers he served under. I treated military service like an extended business trip rather than a calling that shapes entire lives." The conversation was interrupted by the ceremonial music beginning on the pier below. The change of command ceremony would commence in 20 minutes, with speeches, salute exchanges, and the formal transfer of fleet authority to Admiral Morrison. I watched the crowd gathering on the pier, Navy families, local officials, veterans organizations, and maritime history enthusiasts, drawn by the symbolic power of conducting modern ceremonies aboard America's oldest commissioned warship. In the VIP section, I spotted my mother sitting beside Rear Admiral Jackson, one of Dad's former colleagues who'd driven down from Portsmouth specifically for today's ceremony. They were deep in conversation, my mother actually listening, as Admiral Jackson explained the significance of fleet command transitions. "Admiral Quinn?" A young petty officer approached with a message clipboard. "Ma'am, there's a call for you from Secretary Morrison's office. They said it was urgent." I took the call in the ship's restored captain's cabin, surrounded by period furnishings that reminded me how naval tradition connected past service to present responsibility. "Admiral Quinn," the secretary's voice was clear despite the satellite connection, "I wanted to personally inform you that your nomination for the Military Family Commission has been fast-tracked. The Senate Armed Services Committee wants to begin hearings next week." "Next week, sir?" "The Walsh case sparked congressional interest in military personnel policies, and your reforms at Fleet Forces Command caught the attention of several committee members. They want to move quickly on family support improvements." I looked out the cabin's small window at the ceremony preparations below. 5 years of command had taught me that military careers rarely followed expected trajectories, but this acceleration felt different. Not just professional advancement, but the convergence of personal experience with institutional need. "Sir, I'll be ready for the hearings." "Good. Admiral Quinn, this commission has the potential to reshape how we approach military-family relations across all service branches. Your background makes you uniquely qualified to chair this effort." After ending the call, I remained in the cabin for a few more minutes, processing the day's revelations. Emma's strategic recommendation, Victoria's acknowledgement of past misunderstanding, Mother's engagement with military colleagues, the President's commission appointment, all of it represented transformation that went far beyond individual family reconciliation. The ceremony began with traditional naval honors, the kind of pageantry that reminded everyone present why maritime service mattered to national security. As I stood at attention during the national anthem, I thought about the photograph Victoria had returned to me, evidence of a relationship with my father that had existed outside my family's later narrative of disconnection. Perhaps that was the real lesson of the past year, not that families needed to perfectly understand military service, but that understanding could grow when people chose engagement over erasure, curiosity over comfort. The commission work would begin next month, but the foundation had been building for 25 years. Every deployment, every command decision, every moment when I'd chosen service over easier alternatives. As Admiral Morrison assumed command of the Second Fleet, I realized that my next chapter wouldn't be about commanding ships or managing naval operations. It would be about ensuring that other military families never had to choose between service excellence and family connection. Some victories I'd learned are measured not in battles won, but in bridges built for those who follow. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.